Hi guys, Darren at Protopilot here, and in this video I'm going to take you through a talk I did recently at UX Camp Brighton. And the main focus of this talk is to explain to you, I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted here, but for those of you out there they're not too sure how prototyping fits into the design process, this talk is going to take you through a number of ways I think you can use prototyping within your design workflow. Okay, so this talk is called How Prototyping Can Help You Design Better. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so before we get started, I think it's important to define what we think prototyping is. So this is a quote from the Interaction Design Foundation. And it states that prototyping is an experimental process where design teams implement ideas into tangible forms from paper to digital. So that's kind of how they explain prototyping. And it's quite common for us to think about prototyping in the early stages of the design process. We may be putting some wireframes together. We may be putting a click-through prototype together. And it's got a number of benefits, right? It's going to communicate our designs more completely. It's going to cut down on wasted time in development, so the other end of the design process. And it's going to create better product experiences. Okay, we talk about products being delightful and lovely and easy to use. You know, if you're prototyping, you're really building a version of the final product. And for that reason, you're accounting for all the things that you probably don't really account for when you're designing in tools like Figma or Adobe XD. So this is kind of what prototyping is and kind of where the benefits are. Okay, so I was watching a talk by Tom Chi on YouTube a few weeks ago, and Tom Chi was a designer on the Google Glass project. And within this talk, he was talking about the rules of prototyping. So I kind of like these two rules he kind of mentioned. So number one, take the quickest path to a direct experience. So when we think about prototyping, we're really thinking about trying to get to a version of our design which is as realistic as possible. So if we're designing a mobile app, then we really want to get a direct experience of that mobile app, which means we want our prototype to be on a mobile app, on a mobile phone, and we can play with it on our phone, and we can really kind of have a direct experience of that idea. So this is much better than just looking at some frames inside of Figma. When you're doing that, when you're looking at a design on your computer, you're not interacting with it at all. It's a very passive experience, and because of that, you're not going to really think of all of the things that you should be thinking of, or you might think of when you're actually using it. Because when you're using something, you're involving muscle memory, you're involving ergonomics. So there's a whole bunch of things that you're involving when you're using your prototype, as opposed to just looking at it. And the second point that he makes is doing is the best kind of thinking. And what he really means by that is that when you're making something, you're going to be engaging with it a lot more. You're going to come up with more ideas than you are if you're just designing it within Figma or Adobe XD or Sketch. So that's a really important method for designing. You're going to come up with a lot more ideas. Okay, so there's a number of forms of prototyping. So a lot of these you should hopefully be familiar with. One of the kind of, I guess, legacy ones now, I kind of think of it as a legacy one, is paper prototyping. Still used, and it's a really great way of learning how to prototype or starting to think how to prototype, because when you're drawing on paper and you're making things out of paper, so in a very non-digital format, you're really taking away all of the digital tools and all of the friction that comes with them, okay? So that's a really good exercise to do. It's not very time efficient when you're working commercially, but if you think about it, when you're actually sketching ideas, you're kind of starting that process. You're kind of starting the process of thinking about your design in terms of multiple screens. You're drawing buttons, you're thinking about the interactions between those screens. And of course, yes, you could make a paper prototype at that stage. The one I kind of use more often in replacement of the paper prototype is what I call a low fidelity prototype. and I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by this kind of split analogy here, low. You can see I've got low, mid, and high. So in this particular version, I'm still making a digital prototype, but I'm using my sketches to kind of stitch it together. This low fidelity prototype is what you would know as a click-through prototype. And the split of low means that the first low is referring to the visual UI fidelity. So that's the drawing. So it is low because I'm just using a sketch. And then the second low is referring to the interaction and motion design. So I really do think about those two things separately, and I suggest that you do as well. And here we're using a low fidelity interaction model because we're just using that click-through prototype. It's just kind of using there's no animation at all really. We're just kind of having like jump cuts between each screen I've drawn, just to kind of start to get a kind of almost storyboard kind of animatic feel. And if you don't know the word animatic, that's used a lot in the animation industry. When they're starting to think about animations, they put an animatic together, which is a very basic version of the final thing. Their kind of version of a low fidelity prototype, I guess. So that's that one. Next up, we've got low stroke mid fidelity. So we can be using our sketches, we can be using wireframes. So we still want to keep the visual UI fidelity quite low because, as you're probably well aware, the higher fidelity your UI and the more work you put into it, the more kind of wedded you're going to become to that idea, you're kind of more biased you're going to become. And also it takes a lot longer to create those things. So we want to be in this stage where we're kind of trying out lots of ideas, throwing things away. The mid fidelity here is, and I'm using Protopie here, is I'm starting to use some features that Protopie gives me, for example, like access to the camera on my device. So that's a really quick, easy thing to do in Protopie. Obviously, it really makes you start to feel that this app is a real working app. It's using a real camera. You can see your face through that camera, and you can start to get more of a sense of kind of where the design is and whether it's kind of on point. You've kind of accounted for everything. And this is a good stage to kind of try out lots of ideas as well. And then finally, we've got high fidelity. And high fidelity is a prototype. You're still prototyping. I guess there's two kind of parts I think of when I think about high fidelity prototyping. One is that I'm thinking about testing that high fidelity prototype with potential customers, with people that are going to be using the final app experience. And the whole point is to make them think it's a real app without it being the real app. So we're still in that stage where we can throw ideas away. We haven't committed to build, to engineering, to development, but we're certainly giving the impression, the experience that it's a real thing. And you can get very high fidelity with Protopie and other tools out there as well. And then I'm also, the second part of high is I'm starting to involve all of the motion design, so the final motion design as well. And the second part of using a high fidelity prototype is for handoff to developers and engineers. Okay, so I'm now considering all of the motion design, specifically exactly how I want it to work in the app, and I can hand over this, and we'll look at how we can do this a little bit further into the talk. But I'm starting to explicitly show the engineering team exactly how I want my design to work. So that's kind of high. And of course, with all of these, you can kind of mix them up. So I've just kind of put down 3 here, but you could certainly go low, high, you could go mid. So, really, whatever makes sense for your approach. Just remember that you're always trying to get to that direct experience, as Tom said, as quickly as possible. So whatever gets you to understanding what the real problems are and solving those problems as quickly as possible is kind of what your aim should be, okay? Okay, so where can prototyping help you in the design process? We've obviously talked a little bit about that already. Okay, so here I'm going to get a bit more specific. I'm going to highlight some key areas where I think prototyping can really help your design process. Okay, so one of the first and probably a really key point to talk about is how prototyping encourages play. So we ideate through play. It's something that we do from very young, and it's a really core part of being human, okay? So as it turns out, I'm doing a bit of research, And you can read more about this at a website for the National Institute for Play. So there's a lot of neuroscientists there on that website just talking about the neuroscience of play and how important psychologically and socially play is. So it turns out we've got these particular neurons, this kind of like section of our brain in the midbrain, which they kind of defined as play circuits. And play circuits, as I said, it is a core part of being human. You know, when we grow up, we develop all of our social skills through play, and actually play and the play circuits and the neural pathways between our midbrain are actually connected to our higher brain functions as well. So those connections are actually made as we play when we're younger. So we're making connections to our creative centers, we're making connections to all of those kind of parts of our higher brain functions that are really important as we grow up and move into adult life. And when we're continuously using those play circuits, we're really strengthening those pathways, so we're making them stronger. It's really important for movement, it's really important for thoughts and emotions, so we become emotionally connected to things when we play with them. And these play circuits actually get triggered when we're presented with something interactive. So as you can imagine, building a prototype and giving it to someone is going to engage those play circuits, and because it's engaging our kind of the interactive part of our brain, we're going to involve all the different parts, all of our senses, all the different parts of our body, so our muscle memory. We're going to be using all of our senses, touch and sight and sound, and thinking about the ergonomics as well. And that's kind of work on two levels. One, that's going to be really great when we're showing a prototype to somebody, maybe a stakeholder, and they can kind of really experience it, and they can start to think about things that maybe they wouldn't think about if they were just looking at a screen in Figma, kind of in a presentation, so passively kind of watching something. And then the other part is for the designer, so it's the creative side of it. It's like when you start to prototype, you just come up with more ideas. So you know, you can really explore all of those ideas, and I always come up with a lot more ideas when I'm prototyping than I do when I'm passively designing. So in short, we'll experiment and generate more ideas when we're playing. Okay, so the second point I want to talk about is how prototyping forces you to design for interaction. So when we're designing statically, we're spending far less time looking at how things work, and we're really focusing on how things look. Even when you're designing at low fidelity, you're still kind of thinking about how things look, you know, what UI components you're going to be using, where they're going to be situated. And it's very easy actually to just kind of drop into high fidelity design. You start to add some color, maybe you've got a Figma design system and you're dragging things out. And that's very constraining in many ways, especially at the beginning of the creative process. You know, we've all got design systems that we need to adhere to, but we shouldn't really be constraining ourselves too much if we're thinking about an idea from the very beginning. So we want to be sketching, we want to be doing low fidelity prototypes, okay? And the problem with using design systems and by design systems, I'm talking about Figma libraries or sketch libraries, not as opposed to kind of interactive design systems that you might have in code. The problem with those is you're kind of constrained by the interactions of those. You're also really just designing passively. So you're putting those, you're organizing those in a screen, and then you're maybe drawing another frame, and then you're organizing another bunch of components. So it's basically the high fidelity version of just drawing some sketches without thinking kind of what happens in between. And it's really easy to miss things. Certainly from an interaction and motion design perspective, if I'm using something, I might make different decisions about where things should be situated. And even often I find things that I've missed as well. Okay, so here's an example. So in this sketch, I'm primarily thinking about the UI. So I'm looking at kind of this welcome screen with this message, and it's got this button to kind of instigate this camera. Obviously, I'm imagining in my head that this camera's going to pop up somehow, and I'm going to press this button, and then some animation is going to happen. It's going to show me kind of the photo that I've taken. It's going to give me an option to say, like, do I want to keep that photo or do I want to discard it and have another go? But the problem with this at the moment is all the interactions are inside of my head, right? You can't see them. I can see them in my head. So I need a mechanism to show you, to share my vision of the motion design, the interaction design, and that's what I will be using prototyping for. So as you can see here, I've built a very rudimentary prototype. So this is kind of the same ones we saw earlier in the presentation, and you can already start to feel how real that is. You can actually scan the QR code here on the screen if you want to play with this prototype yourself. You just need Prototype Player installed on your phone or your device, but it's really starting to kind of bring it to the fore as to how this is going to be working. At this stage, I'll experiment with lots of different ideas as well. In this particular prototype, I realized that I wanted to have a button to switch between the front facing and the rear camera, something that I didn't really think about when I was drawing it. So it's already starting to kind of highlight certain things I need to be considering. Okay, so third point I want to talk about is how prototyping forces you to design for motion. So it's pretty much the same as we were talking about interaction design. It's very hard to kind of separate interaction and motion from each other. But we don't pay enough attention or much attention at all to motion when we're designing statically. So if you're creating your Figma screens, you're not really thinking probably too much about the motion design. And let's face it, Figma's a great tool, but it's not a motion design tool. It does have some rudimentary prototyping capabilities, but really on the motion side, it's quite basic. One of the key issues for me is the fact that you can't change durations at an object level in Figma. So you can do a transition from one frame to another, but all those durations have to be the same. And if you want to do that, you have to kind of get quite complex in terms of creating kind of lots of intermediary frames to kind of hack that kind of thing. Like I say, great tool, but not a motion design tool. Problem with that is that we do end up delivering all of our design from Figma to our engineering and development teams, and often we've kind of skipped over the motion design part. We're not really thinking too much about exactly how that's going to happen, and it really depends on what you're designing. So if you're designing a mobile app, in comparison to if you're designing a website, the motion is going to be a lot different. You're going to have a lot more motion probably in your mobile app than you would maybe in your website, though that's not always the case, but kind of fundamentally websites tend to be a little bit more basic. If you're doing a TV app, then you've got a different interaction model again, and it's certainly things you need to be thinking about on the motion side of things. So here's an example. So I've got a prototype on the left, which is a feature within Facebook where we've got Facebook stories, and you can see here on the left, this might be a design I might have ended up with if I just handed off the static designs to my engineering team. Especially on the mobile side of things, we have a lot of built-in transitions, and they tend to be quite basic. And the thing is that when you're not considering motion, you're really kind of putting the emphasis on your engineering team to consider the motion for you. And they're often, not motion designers either. They're developers and engineers. They have a lot of experience, but they're not motion designers. And that kind of presents, a few missed opportunities, shall we say. For one, as a designer, you're going to be thinking about motion in terms, or certainly if you're thinking about motion, you can be thinking about how you can use motion to support your brand. So if you've got a really good brand, a really kind of well-defined brand with a tone of voice, you really should have a motion part of that if you think about it. And certainly with brands, that when you think about a brand, you're kind of comparing it. One kind of thing you do within brands, you say, well, if this brand was a person, what kind of person would it be? Well, people speak to you, but they also have body movements as well. They have body language. And you can think about motion design as the body language part of your brand. That's something a developer or an engineer is not going to be thinking about. He or she is going to be thinking about how I transition this particular screen to this other particular screen when this button's pressed. The other kind of really important part of motion that I find is the ability to make your app or your website more usable. So aiding usability, aiding wayfinding, knowing which direction you're going. Motion, if you think about it, in the real world, we have motion. So we have physics. Things don't suddenly appear and disappear. Things speed up and slow down. We have inertia. And we need to be thinking about those same sort of things, because when somebody's using your app or your website, probably more on the app side, they're kind of expecting it to behave the way things should behave in the real world. So physical products that we're using in the real world act based on the physics of the world. So we've got obviously we've got three-dimensional space that we can move in. We've got gravity. All these things are things that we know of, and we have an expectation of how things will work. So we need to kind of think about those when we're designing as well, meeting that mental model of people and helping them understand how our experiences work. And there's an interesting part to this actually. So looking around the internet, doing some research for this talk, I came across this article on the Nielsen Norman Group, and they talk about something called the aesthetic usability effect. And the aesthetic usability effect, apart from being really, really hard to say, refers to a user's tendency to perceive attractive products as more usable. So that's kind of interesting. I mean, this was originally defined apparently back in 1995 by the Hitachi Design Center. And actually when I was working for Microsoft, I worked for Microsoft on Windows 11 on the prototyping side, worked really closely with the motion design team. And all of there was a lot of motion design that was put into Windows 11 as opposed to previous versions. And it got rave reviews. Like, the motion design kind of contributed to people's perception of the operating system being so much more usable, so much more friendly, so much more performant even as well. So you can use motion to kind of give this kind of feeling of performance. And overall, the motion and the UI, so the kind of the visual design of the UI and the motion kind of work together to kind of give people the feeling that the product was really, really good. And this was kind of the aesthetic usability effect, kind of in motion, to use a pun there. Okay, so prototyping helps you uncover things that you have forgotten to design. I love this one. So often there's a lot of interaction design cases that are missed when you're designing statically. So we can see on this split screen, so on the left-hand side, I've got an example of how I might have delivered some designs. I've got two frames. It's a login flow, and you can see on the right-hand side, I've got a prototype. And you'll see that there was a couple of things in the prototype that are not in the static design. Number one is what happens if I tap on an input field? Well, the keyboard's going to come up. I haven't really accounted for the keyboard. What's going to happen to the login button? Is it going to go underneath the keyboard? Is it going to animate up with the keyboard up? What's going to happen? That's kind of a bit of an unknown there. Also, when I'm actually logging in, I'm probably doing an API call. So I need a kind of loading graphic, a loading bar, kind of like a progressive loader or something like that. And I haven't really defined that either, which I did in the prototype. So, you know, it's a really good exercise to make sure that you don't miss these things. Because if you miss these things, they always get captured by your engineering team. And the problem with that is you're then getting a lot of questions kind of at the sharp end. So you're now into delivery, you're now into building the thing. You're probably in sprint, you haven't really got a lot of time, and you're going to have things that you haven't considered. And because you're time constrained, you're going to start to kind of be pressured into making decisions about, you know, what you're going to do about a certain thing. And sometimes you're making decisions which aren't, you know, completely thought out. It'd be much better to make those decisions much higher up the design process, where you've got lots of time to try out different things. So that's a really important reason for doing lots and lots of prototyping all the way through your design process. Okay, so prototyping helps communicate with stakeholders. So I'm sure we've all done this, whizzing around Figma frames, explaining our design. I call this talking interaction design. We're not actually showing the interaction design because we don't have a prototype. We're talking the interaction design. We're saying, you know, when you press this button, we're going to have some sort of transition, and then we're going to go to this screen. These things are going to pop up, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We're kind of talking through it. There's a few problems with this. Number one, it's really hard to follow for the people viewing what you're doing, because you're kind of whizzing around. You might move things accidentally. especially over a call where you got kind of a low frame rate. It relies on you remembering every single thing in terms of your interaction design. So again, probably at the beginning of your design process, you've got it in your head about how things are going to work, but you might miss a thing, or you might forget to kind of explain the thing. It's actually just really hard to kind of get an idea of exactly what this thing's going to look like kind of in the end. And it's that lack of explicitly showing the prototyping which really makes it difficult. Okay, much better to be demoing a prototype, even if you're demoing a prototype passively like this, like you're watching this prototype on screen, it's still engaging you more. Of course, the benefit is also you would have built a prototype which you can use. You can share that out to your stakeholders either during a meeting or after the meeting, and then they can start to play with it. And again, that kind of hooks into what we were talking about earlier in terms of play and how important that is with interactive experiences. Okay, so prototyping helps you to consider real device features and constraints. So we've spoken about this quite a lot already. It's that direct experience again, as Tom Chi said, getting it on a device and really understanding what the real problems are rather than what we think the problems are. One of the things that prototyping helps you do, if you're using the right kind of tool which enables you to do so, because not all tools allow you to put things on target devices, is you're now ergonomically playing with a prototype. It's on a physical thing. You've got that in the real world, if it's on a mobile phone or if it's Google Glass or whatever it might be, or it's a watch app. So you're kind of really testing it not only within itself but within the environment it's going to live in as well. So there are many constraints that we need to design around as digital product designers. And we really want to get to those problems as succinctly and as quickly as possible. The other benefit is the fact that you get to prototype using real hardware features. So as you saw previously, I was using the camera phone and I was starting to consider that within my design. That was really quick to put together and really important for me to consider that when I'm designing rather than kind of making something up that's not real within my Figma designs. And of course, there's lots of different kinds of devices that we design for. So here I've got a prototype I've created in Prototype of a messaging app. So I'm starting to think about the ergonomics here. I'll just be quiet.
Evening, Darren.
Show me the web but this is essentially a voice UI interface, and that's something that you definitely can't do in Figma or Adobe XD or Sketch, is to prototype voice UI. So I don't know how niche it is now. Certainly for TV interfaces, it's a really core part of TV experiences, and it's definitely something we should be thinking about. And then finally, talking about TV interfaces, obviously that's a completely different interaction model. You've got a often clunky remote control with normally 5 buttons on it: an up, a left, a right, a down, and an enter button. And you're obviously pointing that at a screen. You have a kind of a selected state, and you kind of move that selected state around the screen. This is also true for games, in fact, for console games where you've got your controller kind of uses the same model. And prototyping allows you to consider that, to really, it's something we're not necessarily going to be familiar with as much maybe as our mobile phones and our desktop computers. So if you're designing websites on your computer, then that's kind of the target device already, so you're kind of quite close there. For mobile phones, we've kind of looked at that. You can put it on your mobile phone. We use apps all the time. And of course, we use TV as well, but probably certainly for the general population, probably might use it a little bit less. Kind of an interesting stat I heard recently is how small the amount of people there are who are actually watching content streaming as opposed to what we call on broadcast TV is still a much higher segment of usage. So maybe they're not so familiar with exactly how those things work. I can get quite frustrated. So it's really important to be able to prototype on those devices as well. Okay, so prototyping helps you test usability and accessibility. So when I worked at Sainsbury's on the Sainsbury's Nectar app, so when it was relaunched a few years ago. And you can see two prototypes here. So one on the left is a low fidelity prototype, and then the one on the right is actually a high fidelity prototype. But we design prototypes every week. In fact, we did a lab test every 2 weeks. And I can't remember how many prototypes we built, so many. We certainly spent most of our time prototyping rather than designing in a static design tool. And it was really cool. We got loads and loads of insights. We just changed our mindset as a design team as well. How it just became part of our daily routine, to be able to work in these design sprints. We were working in these 2-week design sprints. A week was just a bit too intense, so I kind of suggested that we did it over 2 weeks, gave us a bit more time, especially as we got more to the high fidelity end. We needed a bit more time to kind of create those prototypes. But I can't imagine what the experience would have been like if we hadn't had the capability and the buy-in as well from Sainsbury's at the time. They really valued and understood the value of prototyping and kind of just let us, kind of do what we needed to do. On top of the usability side, we did a lot of accessibility testing as well with people with an array of disabilities, like sight disabilities, motor skills disabilities, and also disabilities on the autism spectrum as well. For example, there's a particular disability for people when they see really bright colours, it actually feels painful to them. Okay, so this was a really important part of the process. So we wanted to make sure that our designs were inclusive, that everyone was getting the same experience and equivalent experience, and we were really accounting for things that we just wouldn't have thought about if we were designing statically. Okay, so final point, prototyping enables collaboration and handover to the development or engineering team, depending where you are. Okay, so this is quite a specific feature to ProtoPie. So here you'll see in something called an interaction recording. So I've built a prototype in ProtoPie. I'm in ProtoPie Cloud, and I'm actually recording myself using my own prototype. And this is a very specific feature. When I save it, you can see now I've gone into this kind of view inside of ProtoPie Cloud where I've got this timeline and I can drag it up and down. I can select all the different points of interaction and I can get all the values. So this is a really easy and good way for sharing your motion and interaction design with your development and engineering teams. You don't need to really document anything manually. Maybe before this existed, and I've certainly worked in teams where I've seen this done, where there's a lot of manual documentation where designers are documenting out easing curves, they're documenting out durations and delays. They may be recording videos, which they may have created in After Effects, which is a great tool, but not an interaction design tool. It's a motion design tool. So they're doing a lot of extra work just to kind of get to the point of being able to communicate this to the engineering team, if they're even doing it at all. A lot of teams, like I said previously, a lot of designers are not thinking about motion design, and they're kind of really relying on the engineering team to kind of fill that gap for them. The other way I've seen people do it is they'll look at other apps or experiences out in the world, and they'll take snapshots of them, kind of videos of them, and they'll just say, can you just copy this? And again, that's kind of really copying other people's designs, which, obviously, we look for inspiration around, but you're not really fully exploring the opportunities that you have with your own brand, which could very, very well be different to what other people are doing with their brands. Okay, so interaction recordings, really cool feature, really useful. I've used it in commercial projects. I'm currently using it now with great effect. Developers and engineers love it, and we used it at Microsoft as well for Microsoft Windows. So there you go. Yeah, really, really worth doing. Okay, so that brings me to the end of my talk stroke rant on why you should be doing a lot more prototyping. I think it's kind of funny that, well, not so much funny, but it's kind of curious, I guess, that we don't really talk about interaction and motion design like a hell of a lot within the product design process. We talk about prototyping. Prototyping has kind of become a wrapper for interaction and motion. And it's amazing actually that how many people, how many design teams out there are not really doing any prototyping. Some are doing just like the click-through fundamental prototyping, but not really considering interaction and motion design as much as they should be. And it's really something we need to kind of embed into our design process. You're going to make your life a lot easier. You're going to bring a lot more value to the projects and the products you're working on. You're going to make other colleagues' lives a lot easier. You're going to make your engineers' lives a lot easier. They're going to really thank you for it. And you're going to, you're going to make your stakeholders happy because you're going to be able to show them things exactly how your design is going to work. And that's going to give them confidence in the design before they commit all of this money, and all of this effort to actually building out something that fundamentally might not work if you haven't kind of looked at that. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now. Thanks for listening. Hope this has been useful for you. Let me know if you like this kind of videos. It's kind of a little bit of a departure away from the how-to videos that you're probably used to if you're a regular watcher of my channel. If you're not a regular watcher of my channel and you haven't subscribed, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps get the word out. I'm on a bit of a mission to try and get all the product designers in the world prototyping and considering interaction and motion design. So, liking the video, subscribing to it really kind of helps me put the word out there, helps me get a lot more coverage. So I really thank you if you're doing that. Really appreciate the support. Okay, so that's about it. I will see you next time with another video. So take it easy.